Hi, and welcome to my webinar, Going Meta in SharePoint, Tricks of the Trade. A couple of housekeeping items first, and here's our agenda. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into the chat, and we'll be sure to follow up either at the end of the webinar, if there's time, or directly with a response in an email to you. We also will be recording or are recording this webinar, so you can watch it later, and we'll send a link to you via email. Thanks very much for coming. So this is my quick agenda today. What is metadata and why should we use it? I think this is an extremely important message, and you're probably all aware of that and bought into that because you're here. But I'll go over why. It's kind of some of the reasons to highlight that, and maybe so you can internally reinforce your own beliefs around that. Types of metadata, metadata in SharePoint, metadata and auto classification, and a case study about what we've done and what we do with metadata. At the end, we'll just quickly review some of those takeaways. First of all, information management is painful. We all know that if we've been involved with information management, that there's a lot of struggles with how we organize information. We're overloaded with information. And we found that out, or we find that out regularly, but specifically one case that we worked on was an auto parts manufacturer, a global automotive organization that made parts for all sorts of different companies and different cars, with 40,000 information workers in their organization and network drives. Millions of documents stored on file shares in what they believed was a very organized manner, but really had no ability to find that information, organize that information, or reuse that information. So of course they bought on-premise SharePoint, and they wanted to use that in order to organize that information. Over 20 million unsorted documents needed to be sorted and classified, and as they were completely unnavigable. And one of the biggest complaints was that search was poor. Even though people knew that documents were somewhere, either on the file share or in the new SharePoint, they couldn't find them. Basically, their information management looked like this, and that led people to feel like this. So let's just step back a minute, and I'll tell you a little bit about who I am. I'm Robert Piddocke. I'm the Vice President of Channel and Business Development here at Concept Searching. Been with Concept Searching for about 9 months now, but I've been in the SharePoint space for over 10 years, working with information and information management, information retrieval, and organization of content. I'm heavily active in the SharePoint community, and I'm a board member of the Office 365 user group, and we're organizing now our next upcoming SharePoint, or rather, excuse me, Office 365 Saturday, which is on April 14th here in Vancouver. So if you're in Vancouver, please do come. It's completely free. I'm also an information management enthusiast, a certified information professional, and I've written 2 books on information retrieval for SharePoint. Concept Searching, as a quick, brief overview, is a company that was founded in 2002. We were founded as search providers, and we built a very interesting and innovative search technology that was able to identify in content what that content was about. I'll tell you a little bit about the algorithm that we use for that, just briefly, before we move into our metadata. But over the years, we stopped providing pure play search and started focusing on content classification. And the reason for this is that we found that our unique algorithm was really good at helping people figure out what their content is about. And over the last 15 years, we've won a number of awards and acquired a lot of large organizations as we help them to classify their content and make sense of their information. How do we do this? Well, as you'll see from my speech today, we believe that taxonomy is the key. This is the core to information management. If you don't have a good controlled vocabulary, you cannot do information management properly. That is really the underlying message here today. And that's what we do. we help build a taxonomy and then apply that taxonomy to improve content lifecycle management, collaboration, search, security, records management, e-discovery, all of the things in this circle we do. Our product is a platform that sits outside of SharePoint, and it doesn't only connect to SharePoint, but it will connect to a number of different systems, including Box, Salesforce, OpenText, file shares, super important one, SQL servers. We do all sorts of different connections and allow you to get a complete classification engine for your entire organization. And the result is, of course, organization automatically and success with information management. How are we different? There are customers and companies that will go out and do similar things to we do. Usually it's keyword matching, just find items in content and then identify them. Sometimes that's for a compliance reason. Sometimes it's for organization reason or a tagging reason. But what we do is different because we use compound term processing, which is a unique statistical algorithm that allows us to see what the content is about. Simple example is triple heart bypass. Triple heart bypass is a concept. It's a phrase that has meaning. It's a surgical operation. Each one of these terms by itself has a completely different meaning or a number of different meanings. And that's very important because we are able to identify compound terms, show them to you, and then make them meaningful and tag content based on those compound terms. So what's the problem? Why do we do this? Why are you here? Well, first of all, as we all know, unstructured data is growing. There's a lot of studies out there that show that unstructured data is growing much faster than structured data. People are generating data at a massive amount. People are also utilizing that data at a huge rate. But it's continually growing and it's becoming unmanageable. I myself am constantly struggling with information overload in both my professional and personal life. And this is really a symptom that is exacerbated by our corporate environment. Most organizations are not prepared and are really behind the curve when it comes to handling information. And this means we have problems. End users are frustrated, where we have issues with legal problems, security leaks, search doesn't work. There's a famous study by IDC that we probably all heard about, that our information workers are spending massive amounts of time, 2.5 hours a day, to find information. And if they can't find it, they're repurposing it. They're making new information. And there's, of course, the ones we mostly hear about. The most common are that we have security and privacy issues. So organizations are getting fined or sued because they're leaking information. We hear about these constantly, and they seem to just be getting worse and worse and more prevalent. So the answer, of course, is metadata. And metadata is really the glue that holds our information together. Unstructured information is not very easy to control. So we add some information on top of that in order to help us control it. And really the ultimate solution, because of the large amount of metadata that we have, is automating that. That we can actually remove the uncertainty that we get from our end users and automate our metadata process. So what's the advantage of metadata? As we know, metadata is our data or our information about our data. So if we have documents and content, we want to be able to have some way to describe that and some information that tells us what that information is about, so that we can handle it better. The advantages of metadata are the ability to develop a single repository, or so we can have a system that holds our information and understands what our information is about. We can eliminate a lot of costs and also a lot of errors that would lead to things like security threats that we might get if we had end users controlling all of this. We can search for content. We can manage information together. We can apply policies to that content. So that might be records management policies or security policies we can apply to across it. And it, of course, helps us to quickly make changes. That might be a migration. It might be just moving things around. If we have good metadata, we can do all of this. And this is where SharePoint comes in. Back in the day, we just put everything in file shares. A lot of organizations still just have file shares. And then we got SharePoint. And when I first started working with SharePoint, I actually thought to myself, what is this thing? Why do we want to put our content into a web-based system when we can just do it on file shares? Of course, SharePoint was quite in its infancy at that time, back before it was SharePoint Portal Server. But I soon started to realize that SharePoint is a metadata machine, and its greatest ability is to help us organize information, whether that's in folders or sites or site collections, libraries and lists. Being able to place things in an organized structure and add metadata to it gives that data a great value, great flexibility. But SharePoint's term store, as it's been built, is not a taxonomy. Your taxonomy is your own set of terms, your own structure that tells what your global information management strategy is about. So we just can't say, oh, I've got some terms in the term set, I have a taxonomy. You actually have a part of a taxonomy. You have pieces of a taxonomy that are being displayed in SharePoint. So you really need to divide these things and build out a taxonomy and then place it into SharePoint so that it can then start to manage your information. You should also ask yourself, is metadata and my metadata a business problem or an IT problem? For too long, information has been an IT problem, which, as we know, is information technology problem. And often technology doesn't actually solve the problem, it just helps us address the problem. So we really need to push that back and say, this is a business problem, we need to do something in a business manner about this. Also, you need to look at what the quality of your metadata is. How much metadata we already have, and you already have metadata, even though you may not think that some things have metadata, everything has metadata. And you should also ask what you're going to use this metadata for, and that's going to help you to determine what kind of taxonomy you're going to build. So why is it so hard to get metadata right? Well, generally speaking, our strategy or our approach to metadata is inconsistent. We don't do the same thing all the time. We don't do it at a global level. It's very subjective. We let people decide their own things. Why not push that work off onto our eventual end users, our information workers, the engineer or the secretary or the records manager? Let them deal with it. Manually tagging content is expensive. Anyone who's even tried to automate this knows that it's extremely expensive to do a manual tagging. And if we can't get our existing workers to do it in their free time, let's say, hiring people to do it is even more expensive. And there are companies that will do this for you overseas that will just have people sit and think about things and tag them. Outrageously expensive. End users don't like doing manually tagging because they don't see the need for it. They don't see the value in it. And I completely agree with them. If my job is an engineer and I've been told that I cannot upload a document until I've added these 5 benign metadata tags to this document, I'm going to be frustrated. I'm going to do whatever is easiest just to get that task over so I can get back to what is really valuable, that's making my job a success and making my company a success. And really, this is not going to change. We can train our users, we can plead with our users, but ideally, we're not going to get any change with it until we remove that task from the end users. So how do you build a taxonomy? I'm just going to jump out and show you what we do with concept searching, and that should probably give you some idea on how metadata can be tagged. Here is our UI for our platform, which is called Concept Classifier. And you can see that we have our taxonomy on the left here. You can easily manage taxonomies in the product. It's laid out in a very easy way to see the taxonomies. And you can have a number of different taxonomies. You can have different groups of taxonomies and different taxonomies below that group. This is extremely important because different taxonomies will give you a different view of different types of information and how to organize that information. You may want to have a very specific type of information as a thesaurus or a subject matter, and you may want to have things based on an organizational unit or something like that. I'll get into that in a second. But I just wanted to show you that it's very easy to manage your taxonomy in the Concept Taxonomy Manager. And once you've got your taxonomy, you can build that out with the information that you have in your own organization. And this is really important because every organization has its own set of content. Even if two companies are doing almost exactly the same thing, they have different vocabulary, different vernacular that they use in their organization. And being able to understand what that is in your organization and use that to build your taxonomy is really important. So I can just go here and suggest clues for this term and get to see what other kinds of terms are actually in my content that concept searching thinks are similar to these. And we're using our unique algorithm to do this. And I can go here and say, okay, so under education and skills, maybe government instructors is a good topic. Cyberspace training is a good topic. And I can quickly create a term in my tree using terms that I found in my content. I'm not making these up. I'm not hiring a librarian. I'm not downloading this taxonomy from some third party. I'm actually getting this taxonomy, building it out in a very rapid way from my own content. Of course, you can also do a lot of things with this taxonomy, move items from one node to the other just by drag and drop. And this taxonomy also syncs to our SharePoint term store. So we're using our managed metadata service here, and we can then have consistency between a number of farms and our taxonomy management here. Okay, back to my presentation. So what are the types of metadata? This is important, and as I mentioned before, you've got metadata that you don't even know that you have. There's structural metadata, and all of this information comes from the National Information Standards Organization, so you can go in and at NISO and look at this and get a more detailed view of this if you want. But there's structural metadata, metadata that tells us about the location, the size, and the file type of these. These are usually default, and SharePoint does a good job of handling these for us already. There's administrative metadata, the date the item was created or last modified, who did it, who has rights to it, and other kinds of classifications that we might apply to it. There's descriptive metadata. So concepts, this is really where the end users come in. What's this document about? What are some terms that make sense of this document beyond all the text that's in the document, or because of all the text that's in the document? And then there's functional metadata. So the purpose of this document. Why did we make it? What department does it live in? These kinds of things. And that's how we build out our taxonomies, is based on hierarchical representation of all of the things that are interesting for our organization. Not because of the information we already have or the information we could have, but what information is going to be of business value to us. And these taxonomies need to be built so that they give our business value. You can start with some information architecture, with some business analysts, and find out what kind of business processes we have and how organization is going to help that. Business taxonomies tend to be less rigid and constrained than other taxonomies, say, for example, organizational unit taxonomies or structured taxonomies built by librarians for our organization. Their point is, of course, to minimize the number of clicks and to minimize the amount of time that end users are using to manage that metadata. And they're always content driven. So we saw in the demo, we're looking at what content we have and building out our taxonomies from that, as opposed to building on a taxonomy and then trying to force that upon our content. Taxonomies provide a single method for classification. So you can have a number of taxonomies, but the idea is that that controlled vocabulary allows us to apply a very controlled idea of what this content is against the documents, as opposed to having our end users just add whatever they wanted. What kind of taxonomies can we have? So this is different than metadata, because the taxonomy is the controlled structure of our metadata. And the types of taxonomies we can have that you should think about using, because you can have a number of them, are lists, like dictionaries. Here's some terms that describe our content, and this can help with search in a great deal, and also with filtering and moving things. We can say, okay, this is a policy, this is a procedure, this is a even things like a term that tells us about what this document is about. You can have a thesaurus that makes synonyms for things, because there's a lot of different ways to say the same thing. You can categorize things, and you can have ontologies. Now, I'll mention ontologies a few times, because ontologies are a very complicated and traditional way of organizing content. Ontologies allow you to have relationships between nodes of different taxonomies. And this is really important, say, for example, in a biological term, a biological setting where we have animals who have properties that are similar, but they don't belong in the same family or genus. In a business, we don't see a lot of value for this, and I'll talk a little bit about that more. In SharePoint, you can, of course, have structure, hierarchical taxonomy, but you can't have an ontology. And there's really good reason for that, because ontologies make things very complicated, and they often cost a lot to manage, but don't give a lot of business value. So Microsoft has not added that capability to SharePoint, and I think that's fine. So where do I start? Well, of course, with any project, the beginning is planning. We need to start with our term set and start to plan out how deep we're going to have it, what our top level nodes for that term set are going to be, and where we're going to place those. How many term sets do we need at really the top level? Do we need a vocabulary and a classification scheme, or are we just good with a vocabulary with some terms that relate to our organization? How is this going to be managed? That's really important, and who is going to manage them? That's a big issue with a lot of things. SharePoint is we don't really have ownership of a lot of things, and the term store or managed metadata service needs to have that structure defined. And also you need to know which site collections are going to use these services. Is it going to be all site collections, or are there different structures in our information architecture as to which ones are going to use and which ones won't? And remember to document how you're building this. keep these in an Excel sheet if you can somewhere, and you don't want to have a ton of redundancy, but you want to have some kind of explanation. SharePoint doesn't help you write very well what the explanation for these terms are. So if you have some specific business process that needs to be applied or understood around these terms in the term set, document that, write that down. Put the term in an Excel sheet and also write down why you've put it there, what the purpose of that. Because just having a taxonomy is not good enough as having a taxonomy that has a purpose. After that, you want to define your global metadata. So terms that apply across your whole organization. Generally, we let our users define their own personal metadata before we start to look at what the whole organization needs. And that's backwards. You should look at your entire organization and what kind of controlled vocabulary at the top level is important. And this is probably something to do with your business purpose or your organizational units, or something more top level about how you're dealing with your products and services. Then assign an owner. Are you going to use subject matter experts, or are you going to leave this to IT? Probably leaving it to IT is not a great idea. In either case, if there's a problem, who is going to be responsible to fix it? And this is the person who should not only have access to that documentation that I talked about just previously, but they should also be the ones probably writing it. And use controlled terms. Don't try to avoid end user driven terms as much as possible. There are 3 great ways to apply these in SharePoint. We can make choice columns so people can choose one of a number of different choices. We can use the managed metadata service, which is really like choice columns on steroids, where we can have a controlled vocabulary, which is of course what we recommend in all cases. Don't just use choice columns. Or you can have lookup columns, which look up from other lists, which is kind of somewhere in between choice columns or choice columns and the managed metadata service term store. Avoid social terms if you can. They really add very little value. I'm not going to go into too much rant about social terms, but yeah, please avoid them if you can. A lot of people become very daunted by taxonomies because we don't know where to start. What are we going to do with this taxonomy service? There's a lot of false starts where people have done things. They go out, they start looking for an existing classification scheme, a simple business vocabulary. And that can almost be worse than just starting on your own. If you apply a very complicated taxonomy, you're going to get a lot of junk terms in that taxonomy that you're going to then have to deal with later. It can be nice to look at those taxonomies that you can download or buy from a vendor, but in most cases, my experience at least, and this is just my personal opinion, is that these are not a great deal of value. There is a free starter taxonomy available for SharePoint from a company called Wand. You can get it at the link below. Don't worry if you don't write it down. You can get this presentation later. But it can give you a really good idea of, and you can see it here in the screenshot, of what a taxonomy for SharePoint looks like or could be. My recommendation is just keep it simple. Start with a couple of nodes. Maybe start with a couple of organizational units that are the most sensitive. For example, HR, and build out a few nodes below that, and then start to build out the nodes of the taxonomy as you continue. Building a taxonomy in SharePoint is very easy to do with the managed metadata service. It can be a little bit, daunting because it's a bit complicated, but completely possible to do. So let's have another look at how we can map workloads in SharePoint with concept searching. Let me see. Once we have our taxonomy, and this taxonomy is synced with SharePoint. So I'll just show you the term store here in SharePoint. This taxonomy, or this term set in SharePoint, is the same that is the term set in our concept taxonomy manager, which is what this piece of concept classifier is called. And we store all of the properties that we write here to SharePoint. So you actually get to keep all of your taxonomy and your controlled vocabulary, your information assets in SharePoint. You can decouple concept searching from SharePoint and still be able to maintain your taxonomy in SharePoint. And that's across multiple farms. So if you have multiple farms, we can sync this taxonomy to all those farms. And we store these properties, which we call clues, from concept searching into SharePoint. As you can see, it's a little bit easier to use Concept Taxonomy Manager than it is to use this term store, but it's not impossible, and it's not that hard to create terms and reuse terms in SharePoint and assign these. These can also be assigned to different users in your organization in SharePoint. Once you have this taxonomy in SharePoint, the idea is to build clues out for this. Now, a clue is not a rule, but clues build rules. So we have a number of different rules for how a specific term might work. And we can quickly, with Concept Classifier, find terms that might fit our specific classification. I'll just add a couple and make them standard clues. We provide a number of different types of clues that we can use for this, give them a value. The idea with the clues is that it's more like fuzzy matching, that we can have two clues that, if they're together, are going to give us enough value to classify that content. And we can add these to the clues. Now, if we find a document that has government instructors and mobile training teams in it together, we're going to classify it as education and skills. But otherwise, we wouldn't classify it if it just found government. So we can actually do some very fuzzy matching for this. And that will automatically match those classifications, apply that classification to the content in SharePoint if we have those clues there. Okay, so I'll jump back to my presentation. So let's talk specifically about metadata in SharePoint. Whoop, it's going too fast. What kinds of metadata can we use in SharePoint? Well, as I said, SharePoint's a metadata machine. So there are a lot of ways to handle metadata, and a lot of different kinds of metadata. And it starts with our libraries, where we can add custom columns. But really, before that, documents already have metadata in them, like types of metadata. We can also build document sets and folders, and you can see in this section there are folders in metadata in SharePoint, and we've organized things into months in this screenshot. I would like you not to do that. The reason why we have SharePoint is we can avoid a folder structure. By moving, I know it's very comfortable to move our folder structure into SharePoint and continue to use that because it gives us some type of feeling of organization, a feeling of structure, which replaces metadata. We don't have to have all tons of metadata if we have a nice structure. But the problem with folders is that our content gets lost in folders. We get many deep folders, we can't find them. We're not enriching the content with folders, we're just hiding it. So don't use folders. Document sets are kind of a nice compromise to that. We can also have taxonomies, manage metadata, and content types. I'm going to talk about each one of these in detail by itself. I just wanted to say don't use folders. So document properties. What kind of properties come along with a document? Of course, name, title, author, when it was last modified. These are all part of the document. You may not think of these as metadata, but they are, because they tell us something about the document. And generally, SharePoint will preserve these. When we upload a document, it'll take these and apply it to it. Document properties are not yet visible in modern document libraries, but that's very soon, or that they will add this functionality. So So we'll be able to handle or see document properties in modern libraries. Custom columns. This is the most popular way to add metadata in SharePoint because pretty much anybody who has administrative access on the site can add their own custom columns and start putting metadata in and forcing metadata. They're calculable, they're sortable, they are the building blocks of content types, which I'll talk a little bit about. You can search on the properties in them, and they're required for things like records management. The problem with custom columns is that generally they're only used for very low level, very local level. So one or two users with their own site might build a whole bunch of custom columns and not map them to manage metadata. So then we just have all sorts of uncontrolled vocabulary across our organization, which is really good for that specific business process, but not good for the entire company. SharePoint has a lot of different types of information we can put in a custom column. As I said, there are three which are more controlled. Our choice columns, which we can give people a choice for. Lookup columns, where we can go and look in another library or a list and pull some information back from that. Or manage metadata, which is really what you should be striving to use. So I talked a little bit about document sets. They are a type of folder, but a folder that has repurposed metadata on them. So every time we create a document set, it comes with a set of metadata that we can then reuse. These are really great for a single work product. So if we have, say, projects, and every project needs a certain set of documents in it, which can be auto-populated in the document set, and certain metadata to help us manage those documents in that set. When we create a document set, those can automatically be provisioned, and we can group common content in those document sets. Like, for example, a very good one, a very common one is a project document, where we need some consistency across those. Document sets are much better than folders because they allow you to search in the metadata that's in the content, and as a folder will hide that content. And of course, part of the purpose of the folder is to give that some structure, and that structure is not well displayed because it's not actual metadata that can be used by search and things like that. You can manage permissions on document sets. I think that's probably the most common reason why someone would revert to a document set as opposed to just using manage metadata, is that it's easy to manage permissions on a specific document set as opposed to each individual item. Content types. Content types are a great tool in SharePoint, which is often hard to understand. But the idea with the content type is I can define any kind of document as a specific type of document. That might be a contract or an invoice or a project plan or any kind of type of content or type of document that my organization might use all the time. And with the content type comes shared properties, so a group of properties. And I can have different content types in a single library and then use that content types to do things like setting retention schedules, or searching on those content types, or just structuring our content as different types of documents. So here's a little, so you say quadrant that I built. I'm not going to call it magic, somewhat less than magic content type, or sorry, quadrant, where I talk a little bit about, or I show what's the best kind of managed metadata or metadata to have, and as opposed to the worst kind, and where you should really go. And as most of these quadrants, if you've seen them, the best is the top right, and the worst is the top left. My two axes are scope, how broadly this metadata can be used in the organization, and control. How much control do I have as an administrator over this content? And of course, in the top right, we have things that are controlled by records management. So content types are up there, where we are actually managing all of the content across the organization with records retention schedules applied to content types. Then as I move to the left and down, I get things like Office 365's new labels, which are a great way to apply retention schedules, but you have a less control of them because you're going to ask your end users, your information workers, to apply those labels. You can decide what the label should be and the content, but there's no, or very little, let's say, control over how those are applied. Your end users have to decide what labels could be applied. Going down in scope, closer to the local level, your site level, or even your library level, we have site terms and library terms. And now we have more control over those because we can apply those to our managed metadata service, but the scope is really just on one site collection. And over to the left and down, of course, tags and just anything that users have to decide themselves. No control and very, very specific scope for those. And those are the ones that give us the least value. So what's new for metadata in SharePoint? I've talked about what the standard SharePoint features are for using metadata, but maybe we can talk about what's new, what's Microsoft doing. And there's a lot going on, especially in Office 365, for expanding the way that metadata is used. You can prompt end users to add metadata. So now when you upload things, you can either in bulk or one at a time, you'll get prompted for adding metadata. There's a new attention view, which can show you a column that shows where metadata is missing and allow you to add it. You can share with OneDrive now with one-time passcodes. OneDrive is really improved, and you can also apply metadata to that. There's a people card and info pane, which will help us to show what people have and what they're shared with others. There's a new migration kit. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about each of these things because we're short on time, but you should look at these things first specifically to see how metadata is improving in SharePoint, and it continues to improve at a dizzying rate. I won't talk about the Bing for Business because I think that's just a way for SharePoint to get people to use Bing. Great. So the last thing I want to show you is just a quick demo of how we automate it, and then automate the process, and then I'll just tell you a little bit about what our takeaways are. So what do we want to do once in an ideal world is really the question, and that is that we have content that has no metadata or very little metadata in it, and we want to be able to look at this metadata and automatically apply that to SharePoint. So I have this document, it's a contract of some other, it's got a contract number in it, it doesn't have a date, but I'm an end user, a contract manager, I want to be able to upload this and see what it's about. And I don't want my end user to really have to stress about doing this. So ideally, I just want them to take this. I think I have this document in here. I think it's this one, and drop it into my library. And what Concept Classifier is doing right now is as this document is being uploaded to this library, is that it is looking into the context or the content of this document, and starting to look at the different properties that are in this and extract those properties. So if I look at one that I've already done here, you can see that this metadata, it's just a little slow, SharePoint. This metadata was not in the document when it was uploaded. I didn't ask my end users to add this metadata. Concept Classifier went out, used the clues to automatically apply this. Not only did it find out what terms would match it, looked in the text, found out what the topic was for that specific document, found that there might be some compliance issues with that document and added that metadata, and also finally extracted that contract number that was in the document and placed that here. So we can do both entity extraction and specific extraction for things. Okay. So I will just skip ahead here because we're quite short on time, but don't use folksonomies, use controlled vocabulary. The same thing with security. If you let your end users manage it, you're going to have problems. So try to keep as much control of your managed metadata as you can, especially in SharePoint, which is really known as being the Wild West of information management. And try to automate it if you can. If you can use a product like ours to go out and make that happen automatically and remove the burden on your end users, that's going to give you a lot better quality content and make your end users a lot happier. So what did we do with our auto parts manufacturer? Well, we applied the same things that I've shown you today to their file shares, tag them in the file shares, move them to SharePoint by creating a taxonomy and doing the auto classification. We trained the system and we trained the people, but we trained the system so that we didn't have to rely on the people. Looked through that content again and again, optimized it over a very short period, and classified their entire content set, their corpus. What we managed to do was reduce their on-premise servers from 50, all these file shares that were all over the place, to just 5 servers. And we got immediate feedback from people that search suddenly started working. They could find things now that they couldn't find before. All of this initial project was achieved in 2 weeks. After that, of course, there's some maintenance that needed to be happened, but there was an administrator that was assigned to that. And we classified 20 million documents in that time. Overall, the customer was extremely happy. So what are the takeaways? Use metadata, not folder. Try to leverage SharePoint as much as you can, and use a managed controlled vocabulary using the managed metadata service. Don't let your end users decide unless there's a very, very good reason of what kind of metadata they should use. Automate it if you can, and invest in information architecture. Any thought you can give to how things should be structured early on is going to give you a payout later on. Great. So that's it for my talk today. I'll have a look at the questions. Unfortunately, we're out of time for our presentation today. I don't want to drag it on. So please come to our next webinar, which is Enough Talk about the GDPR. I know everyone's worried about the GDPR now. So please come. That's on March 14th in 1 month's time. And thank you very much for attending today. I hope it was useful.